In a quiet suburb of Chicago, life moved at its usual pace. The streets were lined with cozy homes, and the air carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass. But amidst this picture of suburban tranquility, there was one man whose presence often went unnoticed: Jameson Jim Rivers. Jim wasn't like the other residents. He didn't have a house with a white picket fence or a car parked in the driveway. Instead, he wandered the streets, his weathered face telling stories of battles fought both abroad and within. Jim had once been someone people looked up to. At 19, full of dreams and determination, he joined the Marines. It wasn't just about escaping the hardships of his childhood. It was about serving something bigger than himself. For years, he wore his uniform with pride, standing tall as a protector of his country. During his time in Iraq, Jim proved himself time and again. He saved lives under fire, earning medals that spoke of courage and sacrifice. Yet when he returned home, the world seemed different, or maybe it was him who had changed. The transition from soldier to civilian life wasn't easy for Jim. The nightmares kept coming, replaying the horrors he had witnessed overseas. His hands would shake sometimes, and the loud noises made him jump. These weren't signs of weakness, but scars of war. PTSD, they called it. Unfortunately, not everyone understood. Employers grew tired of his unpredictable episodes, and soon, job after job slipped through his fingers. His wife tried to stand by him, but the strain became too much. Their marriage ended, leaving Jim alone with nothing but memories of happier days. Without steady work or a support system, Jim's life unraveled further. He found himself living out of a duffel bag, moving from park benches to abandoned buildings. Food came sporadically, often scavenged from dumpsters or donated by kind strangers. Still, despite everything, Jim carried himself with a quiet dignity. There was no bitterness in his eyes, only sadness, a deep, unspoken sorrow that weighed heavily on his shoulders. One chilly evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jim wandered toward a grocery store on the edge of town. Hunger gnawed at him, and he hoped to find something edible in the trash bins behind the building. As he rummaged quietly, trying not to draw attention, a sharp voice pierced the air. "Hey, what are you doing back here?" Startled, Jim turned to see two police officers approaching him, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Jim raised his hands instinctively, palms open, signaling he meant no harm. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. "Just looking for some food." The officers exchanged skeptical glances. One of them shone his flashlight directly into Jim's face, blinding him momentarily. "You know you're trespassing, right?" the officer asked sternly. Jim nodded, lowering his gaze. He knew arguing wouldn't help. Despite his calm demeanor, the officers decided to take him in. They cuffed his wrists tightly and led him to their patrol car. Jim didn't resist. He had learned long ago that fighting back only made things worse. As he sat in the back seat staring out the window at the blurry lights of the city, he wondered if anyone would even notice he was gone. To most people, he was invisible, just another faceless figure on the street. News of Jim's arrest spread quickly. A passerby had filmed part of the encounter on their phone, capturing the moment the officers confronted him. The video showed Jim being handcuffed, his thin frame slouched in defeat. Within hours, it went viral online, sparking outrage among viewers. Many accused the police of using excessive force against someone who clearly posed no threat. Others pointed out the irony. Here was a man who had risked his life for his country, now treated like a criminal simply for trying to survive. Yet, for all the anger directed at law enforcement, few people truly understood who Jim was. His name hadn't been mentioned in the news reports, nor had his military service been highlighted. To the public, he was just another homeless man caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Little did anyone know, Jim's story ran far deeper than anyone could imagine, and it was tied to the very fabric of the community where he now awaited trial. As Jim sat in a cold, dimly lit holding cell, memories flooded his mind. He thought about his father, Corporal Daniel Rivers, a man revered as a local hero. Growing up, Jim had idolized his dad, listening intently to tales of bravery during World War II. Those stories shaped him, pushing him to follow in his father's footsteps. Now, decades later, Jim couldn't help but wonder what his father would think of him today. Would he be proud, or would he see only failure? Outside the jail walls, the town buzzed with debate. Some demanded justice for Jim, while others defended the actions of the police. What none of them realized was that Jim's case was about more than just trespassing. It was about recognizing humanity in its most vulnerable form. And though Jim remained unaware of the growing movement on his behalf, seeds of change were already being sown. All it would take was one person brave enough to dig deeper, to uncover the truth hidden beneath layers of neglect and misunderstanding. As Jim sat in the cold, sterile confines of his jail cell, time seemed to stretch endlessly. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above him, casting harsh shadows on the concrete walls. His mind wandered back to moments he had tried so hard to forget. Memories of battles fought, friends lost, and promises broken. There was a dull ache in his chest, not just from hunger or exhaustion, but from years of carrying burdens too heavy for one man to bear. Jim had once been proud of who he was: a Marine, a protector, someone people could count on. He remembered the day he enlisted, standing tall in the recruitment office, his heart pounding with excitement. Back then, he believed joining the military would give his life purpose. It did, but not in the way he had imagined. War changed him, in ways he couldn't explain to anyone, not even himself. The camaraderie of his fellow soldiers had been a lifeline during those dark days overseas. But when he returned home, that sense of belonging vanished. Civilian life felt foreign, almost alien. The world moved forward, leaving him behind like a relic of a forgotten era. His PTSD made everyday tasks feel insurmountable. Loud noises sent him diving for cover, flashbacks haunted his dreams, and simple conversations often left him overwhelmed. Jobs came and went because employers didn't understand why this decorated veteran struggled to keep up. Each failure chipped away at his self-worth until there was little left. His marriage crumbled under the weight of his emotional scars. His wife, Sarah, had tried to help, but eventually, she walked away, unable to cope with the toll it took on their relationship. Losing her was like losing a piece of himself, and after that, Jim stopped trying altogether. Now, sitting in this cell, Jim felt invisible. To the officers who arrested him, he was just another vagrant causing trouble. To the public watching videos online, he was a symbol of injustice, but still they didn't know him. They didn't know about the medals tucked away in a box somewhere gathering dust. They didn't know about the nights he spent staring at the stars, wondering if he'd ever find peace. And they certainly didn't know about his father, man whose name inspired reverence throughout the town. Meanwhile, in an office across town, Sarah Klein prepared for Jim's upcoming trial. A young and passionate public defender, Sarah had seen her fair share of cases involving homelessness and mental health issues. Most were heartbreaking, but something about Jim's story struck a chord with her. When she first met him in the jail's visiting room, he barely looked up. His clothes were dirty, his beard unkempt, and his eyes carried a sadness that words couldn't capture. But beneath the grime and despair, Sarah sensed a quiet strength. She introduced herself gently, explaining that she would represent him in court. Jim nodded, offering only a mumbled thank you before lapsing into silence. Determined to build a solid defense, Sarah began digging deeper into Jim's background. At first, she focused on the details of his arrest, the circumstances, the charges, and whether the police had followed proper protocol. But as she reviewed his file, something caught her attention. Buried among the paperwork was a reference to Jim's military service. Curious, Sarah requested access to his records. What she discovered shocked her. Jim wasn't just any veteran. He was a decorated hero. His file detailed acts of extraordinary bravery during his time in Iraq. One account described how he single-handedly dragged 3 wounded comrades to safety during an ambush, shielding them with his own body despite being injured himself. Another highlighted his leadership skills and unwavering dedication to his unit. These weren't the actions of a man who deserved to be treated as a criminal. They were the actions of someone who had sacrificed everything for his country, But Sarah's investigation didn't stop there. As she delved further, she uncovered a connection between Jim and the very town where he now faced trial. Jim had grown up here, attending the local high school just blocks away from the courthouse. Even more surprising was the revelation that his father, Corporal Daniel Rivers, was a celebrated war hero whose legacy lived on in monuments scattered throughout the community. For Sarah, this discovery was pivotal. It wasn't just about defending Jim anymore. It was about reminding the town of the sacrifices made by families like his. With newfound determination, Sarah visited Jim again. This time, she brought copies of his military records and photos of him in uniform. She laid them out on the table between them, watching as Jim's expression shifted from confusion to recognition. "Do you remember these?" she asked softly. Jim picked up one of the pictures, his fingers trembling slightly. It showed a younger version of himself, standing tall and smiling alongside his fellow Marines. "I remember," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "That was a long time ago." Sarah leaned closer, her tone earnest. "Jim, I need you to trust me. I want to tell your story, not just the part about what happened last night, but everything. Your service, your struggles, your family. People need to know who you really are." For the first time since his arrest, Jim felt a flicker of hope. Maybe someone finally saw him, not as a homeless man or a trespasser, but as a person with a history, a legacy, and a future worth fighting for. Back at her desk, Sarah drafted her strategy for the trial. She knew the prosecution would paint Jim as a nuisance, someone who disrupted the peace and order of the community. But she also knew that narrative was incomplete. Jim wasn't just a statistic, he was a human being whose life had been shaped by sacrifice and resilience. Her goal was clear: to show the court, and the entire town, that dismissing Jim meant dismissing the values they claimed to hold dear. As she worked late into the night, Sarah couldn't shake the image of Jim sitting alone in his cell. Despite everything he had endured, there was still a spark of dignity in him, a quiet refusal to let bitterness consume him entirely. That spark gave her hope. If she could ignite it in others, perhaps Jim's story wouldn't end in a courtroom. Perhaps it could become a catalyst for change, a reminder that even those society casts aside deserve compassion and respect. Little did Sarah know, her efforts were about to uncover truths that would leave the entire town reeling. Because while Jim may have been invisible to most, his name carried weight far beyond what anyone expected. And when the truth came to light, it would force everyone to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, honor, and the true cost of forgetting those who served. The morning of the trial arrived, and the small courtroom buzzed with anticipation. It wasn't every day that a case involving a homeless man garnered so much attention. Reporters lined the back rows, clutching notebooks and cameras, eager to capture the drama. Residents filled the benches, their faces reflecting a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Some had seen Jim around town, the disheveled figure rummaging through trash bins or sleeping under bridges, but few knew anything about him beyond his current state. The air was thick with tension as everyone waited for the proceedings to begin. Jim shuffled into the room escorted by a bailiff. His appearance drew murmurs from the crowd. He wore clothes provided by the jail, ill-fitting and faded, and his hands were cuffed in front of him. Despite the weight of all eyes on him, Jim kept his gaze fixed on the floor, avoiding contact with anyone. To most people in the room, he looked like exactly what the prosecution intended to portray, a vagrant who had violated property laws and disrupted the peace. But Sarah Klein, sitting beside him at the defense table, saw something different. She saw a man carrying decades of pain and sacrifice, a man whose story deserved to be told. Prosecutor Mark Ellis stood first, addressing the judge and jury with practiced confidence. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady and authoritative, "this case is straightforward. The defendant, Jamison Rivers, was found trespassing on private property late at night. This isn't just about one incident, it's about maintaining order in our community. If we allow individuals to break the law without consequence, where does it end? We must hold Mr. Rivers accountable for his actions." Ellis went on to describe the events leading up to Jim's arrest, emphasizing how the police responded to a noise complaint and discovered Jim scavenging behind the grocery store. He painted a picture of Jim as someone who disregarded rules and boundaries, contributing to the growing issue of homelessness in the area. The prosecutor's tone was measured but firm, designed to sway the jury towards seeing Jim as a problem that needed solving rather than a person with a complex history. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she took a deep breath and rose slowly. Her demeanor was calm, almost serene, as she faced the judge and jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and unwavering, "before we rush to judgment, let us take a moment to consider who this man truly is." She gestured toward Jim, who sat hunched over, still staring at the floor. "Jameson Rivers is not just a name on a charge sheet. He is a veteran, a hero, and a son of this very community." Sarah stepped closer to the jury box, making eye contact with each drawer. Rivers served 2 tours in Iraq as a Marine. During his time in the military, he displayed extraordinary courage, risking his life to save others. "Let me show you." She turned to a projector screen set up in the corner of the room and clicked a button. A series of photographs appeared. One, showing Jim in full uniform, standing proudly alongside his fellow soldiers. Another capturing him mid-action during a mission, his face smeared with dirt but resolute. The images were powerful, evoking a sense of respect and admiration. "These aren't just pictures," Sarah continued. "They represent years of service, sacrifice, and dedication to our country. Mr. Rivers earned medals for bravery, including one for rescuing 3 wounded comrades during an ambush. Yet when he returned home, he didn't receive the support he needed. Instead, he struggled with PTSD, lost jobs, and eventually found himself living on the streets. Does that sound like the behavior of a nuisance? Or does it sound like the story of a man who gave everything and received nothing in return?" The courtroom grew quieter as Sarah spoke. Even Ellis shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sensing the tide turning against him. Sarah pressed on, revealing more about Jim's connection to the town. "Mr. Rivers grew up right here," she said, pointing vaguely out the window. "He attended high school just blocks away from this courthouse, and his father, Corporal Daniel Rivers, is a name many of you might recognize." At the mention of Daniel Rivers, whispers rippled through the audience. Corporal Rivers was a local legend, a World War II hero whose valor had saved countless lives during D-Day. Streets bore his name, plaques honored his memory, and generations of residents had grown up hearing tales of his bravery. For Sarah, this revelation was crucial. "Yes," she confirmed, her voice rising slightly. "Jameson Rivers is the son of Corporal Daniel Rivers, a man whose legacy is woven into the very fabric of this community." She paused, letting the significance sink in. Then turning back to Jim, she added softly, "This isn't just about trespassing. It's about recognizing the humanity of someone who has already given so much. Someone whose family has sacrificed everything for this town and for this nation." Now the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. Jurors exchanged glances, some nodding thoughtfully while others wiped away tears. Even Judge Eleanor Hayes, who had maintained a stoic expression throughout the trial, seemed visibly moved. She leaned forward slightly, studying Jim with newfound interest. "Ms. Klein," the judge interjected, her tone measured but probing. "You mentioned Corporal Daniel Rivers. Is there any relation between him and the defendant?" Sarah nodded, stepping aside to allow Jim to answer. For the first time, Jim lifted his head, his weary eyes meeting the judge's. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice barely audible. "He was my father." A collective gasp swept through the room. People sat up straighter, craning their necks to get a better look at Jim. Some older residents exchanged knowing looks, recalling stories of Daniel Rivers' heroism. Others whispered to their neighbors, piecing together the connection. In that moment, Jim ceased to be a nameless, faceless figure. He became the embodiment of a legacy, a reminder of sacrifices made long before anyone in the room was born. Judge Hayes studied Jim intently, her brow furrowed in contemplation. Finally, she spoke, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "All rise," she commanded. One by one, people stood, not because they were ordered to, but out of genuine respect. Veterans in attendance saluted, their hands snapping to their foreheads in unison. Tears streamed down the faces of those who remembered Daniel Rivers' contributions. Even Prosecutor Ellis, though clearly flustered, rose awkwardly to his feet. The gesture was spontaneous yet profound, a testament to the power of recognition and remembrance. As the courtroom stood in unified reverence, Jim remained seated, overwhelmed by the sudden outpouring of emotion. He blinked rapidly, trying to process what was happening. For years he had felt invisible, dismissed as a burden on society. Now, in this unlikely setting, he was being acknowledged, not just as a homeless man, but as the son of a hero and a hero in his own right. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on Jim's shoulder, leaning close to whisper, "You see, you're not alone anymore." For the first time in what felt like forever, Jim allowed himself to believe her. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. He still faced challenges that couldn't be erased overnight. But in this moment, surrounded by people standing in solidarity, he felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps justice wasn't just about punishment after all. Perhaps it could also be about redemption, reconciliation, and remembering the humanity within us all. The courtroom was silent except for the faint rustle of clothing as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. All eyes were on Judge Eleanor Hayes, who had just asked Jim the question that changed everything. "Mr. Rivers, are you related to Corporal Daniel Rivers?" Jim hesitated for a moment, his throat tight with emotion. He nodded slowly, his voice trembling as he replied, "Yes, Your Honor. He was my father." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, reverberating through the room and leaving an indelible mark on everyone present. For many in the courtroom, the name Daniel Rivers wasn't just familiar. It was legendary. Corporal Daniel Rivers had been a beacon of courage during World War II, a man whose actions on D-Day had saved countless lives. His story was etched into the collective memory of the town, celebrated in parades, commemorated on plaques, and taught to schoolchildren. Streets bore his name, parks were dedicated to his memory, and even the courthouse where they now sat featured a bronze statue of him out front. As the realization dawned, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Older residents exchanged knowing glances, recalling tales of Daniel's bravery. Younger attendees turned to their elders, whispering questions about this long-revered hero. Some wiped away tears while others simply stared at Jim, struggling to reconcile the disheveled man before them with the son of a man they had idolized. Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly, her expression softening but still sharp with curiosity. "Would you mind telling us more about your father?" she asked gently. It wasn't a typical request in a courtroom setting, but this trial had already veered far from the ordinary. Jim swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the defense table for support. For years he had avoided talking about his father, not because he was ashamed, but because it hurt too much. Memories of Daniel were bittersweet, filled with pride and longing. Now, under the weight of so many expectant gazes, Jim found himself unable to stay silent any longer. "My dad, he was a good man," Jim began, his voice barely above a whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again, louder this time. "He joined the army when I was little. Mom used to tell me stories about how brave he was, how he always put others first. When he came back from the war, he didn't talk much about what happened over there, but sometimes late at night he'd sit by the window and stare outside, like he was watching something only he could see." Jim paused, collecting himself. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his arm, encouraging him to continue. "Dad instilled values in me: honor, duty, sacrifice. He told me that serving your country wasn't just about wearing a uniform. It was about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. That's why I joined the Marines after high school. I wanted to make him proud." His voice cracked as he added, "I don't know if I ever did, though. After everything that happened, the war, losing my job, ending up on the streets, I feel like I let him down." The courtroom was utterly silent now, save for the occasional sniffle or muffled sob. People listened intently, their hearts breaking for the man who had carried such a heavy burden alone for so long. Even prosecutor Mark Ellis seemed shaken, his earlier confidence replaced by discomfort. He glanced around the room, sensing the tide had turned irrevocably against him. Judge Hayes, visibly moved, addressed the court. "Ladies and gentlemen, we stand today not only in judgment of Mr. Jameson Rivers, but also in recognition of the legacy of Corporal Daniel Rivers, a man whose heroism shaped this community and inspired generations. To learn that Jameson is his son adds another layer of complexity to this case. Before we proceed further, I believe it is fitting to honor that legacy." With those words, she rose from her seat and made an unprecedented request. "All rise." One by one, people stood, not out of obligation but out of genuine respect. Veterans in attendance saluted sharply, their hands raised to their foreheads in a gesture of solidarity. Others placed their hands over their hearts, heads bowed in reverence. Reporters stopped scribbling notes. Cameras lowered momentarily as even they were swept up in the gravity of the moment. Jim remained seated, overwhelmed by the sudden outpouring of emotion. Tears streamed down his face as he looked around the room, seeing faces he had never met but who now regarded him with compassion and admiration. For years, he had felt invisible, dismissed as a nuisance or ignored entirely. Now, in this unlikely setting, he was being acknowledged not just as a homeless man, but as the son of a hero and a hero in his own right. Sarah leaned close to Jim, her voice soft but firm. "This changes everything," she whispered. "You've shown them who you really are. Let's finish this." When the courtroom finally settled back into its seats, Judge Hayes turned her attention to Prosecutor Ellis. "Mr. Ellis," she said, her tone authoritative yet compassionate, "given the circumstances, do you still wish to pursue charges against Mr. Rivers?" Ellis hesitated, clearly caught off guard. He glanced at his notes, then at the jury, whose members were now exchanging meaningful looks. Finally, he sighed and shook his head. "Your Honor, in light of the new information presented, I believe dismissing the charges would be in the best interest of justice." A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. Jim slumped slightly in his chair, the weight of uncertainty lifting from his shoulders. Sarah squeezed his hand, offering a small smile of reassurance. Though the legal battle was over, both knew the real work was just beginning. After formally dismissing the case, Judge Hayes addressed Jim directly. "Mr. Rivers, I want to thank you for sharing your story with us today. You have reminded us all of the sacrifices made by those who serve, and the importance of supporting them when they return home. This court will not forget you, nor will this community." Her words resonated deeply with everyone present. As Jim was led out of the courtroom, reporters clamored for interviews and residents approached him with offers of help. Local organizations pledged housing assistance, counseling services, and employment opportunities. A GoFundMe campaign launched. Within hours, raised tens of thousands of dollars, allowing Jim to take the first steps toward rebuilding his life. In the days that followed, Jim became a symbol of resilience and redemption. His story spread beyond the confines of the small suburban town, inspiring conversations about how society treats its veterans and homeless populations. People began volunteering at shelters, advocating for better mental health resources, and pushing for policy changes to ensure no one else fell through the cracks. For Jim, the journey was far from easy. Decades of hardship couldn't be erased overnight, and healing required time, patience, and support. But for the first time in years, he felt hopeful. Surrounded by a community determined to lift him up, he began piecing together fragments of a life he thought he'd lost forever. And though scars remained, both visible and invisible, Jim finally felt seen. Not as a burden or a statistic, but as a person worthy of care, respect, and love. In honoring his father's legacy, the town had unknowingly honored him too, proving that even in moments of despair, humanity has the power to shine brightest. Weeks turned into months, and the small suburban town that once viewed Jim as a nameless figure on its fringes now embraced him as one of its own. The trial had been a turning point, not just for Jim, but for the entire community. It forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about how they treated their most vulnerable citizens, and reignited conversations about the sacrifices made by veterans and their families. For Jim, this newfound support marked the beginning of a journey toward healing, redemption, and purpose. With the charges against him dismissed, Jim was finally free to leave the jail behind. But freedom wasn't just about walking out of those cold, sterile walls. It was about stepping into a world that suddenly seemed willing to welcome him back. Local organizations rallied around him almost immediately. A veterans advocacy group secured temporary housing for him in a clean, furnished apartment close to the town center. Volunteers helped him settle in, bringing groceries, clothes, and other essentials. One volunteer even gifted him a framed photo of his father, Corporal Daniel Rivers, that she had found at the local historical society. Jim placed it on the mantle above his fireplace, where it became a constant reminder of the legacy he carried. The financial support poured in too. The GoFundMe campaign raised over $75,000 within days, with donations coming not only from residents of the town, but also from strangers across the country who had read Jim's story online. At first, Jim struggled to accept the generosity. He had spent years believing he didn't deserve kindness or help, but Sarah, his attorney-turned-friend, encouraged him to see it differently. "This isn't charity," she told him firmly. "It's gratitude for everything you've done and for reminding us what really matters." With the funds, Jim paid off old debts, purchased new clothes, and invested in therapy sessions to address the lingering effects of PTSD. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to open up about the nightmares, the flashbacks, and the guilt that had haunted him since returning home from Iraq. His therapist, Dr. Emily Carter, worked patiently with him, helping him untangle decades of pain and rediscover his sense of self-worth. Slowly but surely, Jim began to heal. Not completely, but enough to feel like life might be worth living. Again, the town didn't stop there. Recognizing Jim's potential, a local construction company offered him a job as a site supervisor. Though hesitant at first, Jim accepted the offer after learning that many of the workers were fellow veterans. Being surrounded by others who understood his struggles made the transition easier. On his first day, he arrived early, dressed in freshly pressed work boots and a hard hat someone had lent him. As he introduced himself to the crew, he felt a spark of pride, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Over time, Jim proved himself invaluable, earning the respect of his co-workers and supervisors alike. His leadership skills, honed during his military service, shone through, and before long he became an integral part of the team. But Jim's impact extended beyond the workplace. Inspired by the outpouring of support he received, he decided to give back to the community that had embraced him. With Sarah's encouragement, he began volunteering at a local shelter for homeless veterans, sharing his story and offering guidance to those struggling to rebuild their lives. "I've been where you are," he would say during group meetings, his voice steady and reassuring. "And I'm here to tell you that things can get better. You're not alone." His words resonated deeply with the men and women who listened. Many saw themselves in Jim, their own battles mirrored in his journey. Veterans who had once felt invisible or forgotten found solace in knowing that someone understood their pain. Jim became more than a mentor. He became a beacon of hope, proof that redemption was possible no matter how far someone had fallen. As word of Jim's transformation spread, invitations started pouring in. Schools asked him to speak at assemblies, teaching students about the importance of service, sacrifice, and resilience. Community groups invited him to fundraisers, galas, and memorial events, eager to honor both him and his father's legacy. At first, Jim declined most requests, unsure if he was ready to step into the spotlight. But Sarah reminded him of something important. "Your story has power, Jim. It inspires people to do better, to be better. Don't let that go to waste." Eventually, Jim agreed to share his experiences publicly. Standing before crowds of attentive listeners, he spoke candidly about his triumphs and failures, his regrets and hopes. He talked about his father's bravery during World War II and how it shaped his own decision to join the Marines. He recounted the horrors of war, the challenges of reintegration, and the despair of homelessness. And he ended every speech with a message of gratitude for the soldiers who served alongside him, for the family who loved him despite his flaws, and for the strangers who refused to turn their backs when he needed them most. One particularly poignant moment came several months later during the dedication ceremony for a new Veterans Memorial in the town square. Designed to honor all branches of the military, the monument featured engraved names of local heroes, including Corporal Daniel Rivers. When organizers asked Jim to speak at the event, he hesitated, fearing he wouldn't find the right words. But on the day of the ceremony, standing beside Sarah and wearing his old dress blues, he delivered a speech that left the audience in tears. "I never thought I'd stand here today," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "not because I didn't believe in myself, but because I didn't think anyone else would. For years I felt invisible, like my sacrifices didn't matter anymore. But this town showed me otherwise. You reminded me that no matter how far we fall, there's always hope if people care enough to lift us back up." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces before him. "My father taught me that true courage isn't about being fearless, it's about facing your fears head on, even when the odds are stacked against you. Today I ask each of you to carry that lesson forward. Look out for the people around you, the ones who seem lost, the ones who feel forgotten, because sometimes all it takes is one act of kindness to change a life forever." Applause erupted, echoing through the square as veterans saluted and civilians wiped away tears. Jim stood tall, his chest swelling with pride, not just for himself but for the community that had come together to make this moment possible. For so long, he had carried the weight of his past alone. Now he realized he didn't have to anymore. In the months that followed, Jim continued to thrive. He reconnected with distant relatives, mended broken relationships, and even adopted a dog named Max from the local animal shelter. Max, a scrappy mutt with boundless energy, became his constant companion, bringing joy and laughter into his life. Together they took long walks through the park, stopping occasionally to chat with neighbors who greeted Jim warmly. Though scars remained, both visible and invisible, Jim learned to live with them. Therapy helped him manage his PTSD, while friendships provided a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. Most importantly, he rediscovered his purpose. Whether mentoring veterans, speaking at events, or simply lending an ear to someone in need, Jim dedicated himself to making a difference. In doing so, he honored not only his father's memory but also the values he had fought so hard to uphold. Looking back, Jim marveled at how much had changed since that fateful night behind the grocery store. What began as a routine arrest had sparked a chain reaction, transforming not just his life but the lives of countless others. The town that once overlooked him now celebrated him as a symbol of resilience and redemption. And though he knew challenges still lay ahead, Jim faced them with renewed strength and determination, because he finally understood something profound. No matter how dark the night, dawn always comes. And sometimes, all it takes is one person, brave enough to rise and shine a light, for themselves and for everyone lucky enough to witness it.